Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second of the Migration Policy Centre lockdown webinars. So we're the Migration Policy Centre at the European University Institute in Florence, although none of us are in the European University Institute because it's been closed for around 6 weeks, 7 weeks now. But we're very happy to welcome you to today's seminar, which is on the theme of migrant workers under the COVID-19 lockdown. We've got three really great presenters for you this afternoon, and I'll introduce each of them quickly now. We have Gabriella Sanchez, who's a research fellow at the Migration Policy Centre, Letizia Palumbo, who's also a research fellow at the Migration Policy Centre, and Marley Monacello from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida. So we've got three great talks, particularly focused on agriculture and farm work. Each presenter is going to speak for around 10 minutes, which will leave us plenty of time for questions. But just as a housekeeping note to explain how we do the questions, you need to submit the questions using the chat function. So you'll see a command on your screen, which is chat. So for any questions that need to be sent via the chat function, it's impossible to manage otherwise, given the number of participants we have. So we're delighted that so many people have joined us. And as I say, for the questions, please submit them via the chat function. So I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Gabriella Sanchez from the Migration Policy Centre at EUI. And she's going to speak about the issue of how, well, the title is More Than Migrant Workers, Migrant Responses to COVID-19. So hand over to Gabriella.
Perfect. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. We are so excited that all of you are able to join, and especially with the number of people who sign up. So I think that's a very good indication of the kind of interest that the topic is generating. We're also, I have to say, very excited about, very fortunate to have the power to hold to organize the workshop today. I have to tell you, Marley, I am so excited that Letizia was able to coordinate the presence of Immokalee. Immokalee is, I don't even have the words to describe how powerful the work that they have conducted over the years has been. So personally, I'm really grateful that you were able to join us today. So thank you so much for doing that. Let me move right to the presentation, which, you know, in a very academic fashion, I have retitled a little bit. So it is now titled Beyond Migrant Workers, and the way we can reconceptualize the migrant labor under the COVID-19 response. My presentation is going to, in a sense, it's an attempt to give us some concepts, you know, in preparation to the two empirical presentations that are going to follow. And I'm going to start precisely talking about the nature of the discourse, what we have been seeing over the last few weeks regarding COVID-19. So there is this discourse, policy and discourse on migrant labor that is very much connected to images, images concerning caregiving, hospital solidarity across Europe, and also in the United States. So we see these images of people on the one hand clapping for first care responders and the people who are actually performing some of the essential tasks for many of us to survive. On the other hand, we have also been presented with an overabundance of images of poor and destitute migrants, you know, in a fashion that portrays it as this poverty and sense of decay were inherent to them, as if it was natural to them. There's also this language of invisibility. There's all of these references that we have to people, you know, quote unquote, coming out of the shadows or have never been seen. And here, you know, my presentation is a critique, in a sense, of this rhetoric, you know, that we have been given over the last few weeks, that we have been presented with over the last few weeks, because it is very much centered on labor. This notion, this neoclassic, very capitalistic conceptualization that migrant labor can be simply extracted or used to jumpstart the economy. So most of the conversations that we have seen over the last few days have been on the consequences of the lack of migrant labor, what it's going to take for the economy in both sides of the Atlantic to get to normal standards, to normal levels, and how we are going to create, right, as policymakers, as academics, the structures or the channels allowing for employers to have access to workers and for workers to have access to multiple workplaces, either field, the agricultural fields in this case, hospitals or households where people perform intimate and personal forms of care. I'm sure that you have seen that there's been plenty of mechanisms that are already out there. Oh, I've just been told that you can't see my slides. I will be very happy to share them with you. Unless there's well, let me continue so that we don't lose any time. I'm sure that you have seen there's plenty of mechanisms. As I once said, here in Europe, we have seen plenty of examples of Eastern European migrants that are being flown to Germany and the UK. There's all of this conversation of the asparagus. In the case of Mexico, we are very much aware of the fact that labor visas, primarily for agricultural labor, have been continued to be issued. And here in Italy, as we will also hear from Letizia, there's this discussion concerning the regularization of migrants from the agricultural sector primarily. Perfect. So what is happening with discourse? So we have a discourse of labor, but it's also a discourse of inequality. And that is because none of the proposals that we have been given, or that even ourselves in policy circles or in academic circles have articulated, conceptualize migrants beyond them being labor, beyond their labor capabilities, the ability to work, their ability to contribute to production chains. This has consequences, and one of them is the fact that it reaffirms or reasserts the notion that notions of racialized, of race and gender notions. Migrants are becoming racialized or gender, they already are, as laborers only. This only reaffirms labor hierarchies. We have also heard quite a bit about this notion of the great agricultural army, right, that romanticizes a form of labor that Europeans are going to go and perform to rescue the nation. But I say that we romanticize this because countries are in fact not willing to sustain the kinds of conditions, the labor conditions that their own citizens would demand. And that is because the very premise of agricultural labor is this low-paying form of labor that ensures low costs for mass distribution. So it doesn't assume any kind of social restructuring. Here I will move to, just talking really quick about migrant labor conditions, the way they are structured, and I'm sure that Letizia is also going to touch on some of these points, but what we have, and what is at the core of what my critique here, is that migrant labor conditions systematically allow specific groups of people to remain in specific production chains. And these are, once again, agriculture, care, intimate forms of labor. And this does not create at the same time paths for socioeconomic mobility. So we are okay with migrants staying in this kind of fields, for migrants to perform very specific forms of labor. We need them where they can be accessible, where they're easily accessible for our socioeconomic goals or purposes. This, in fact, once again, ensures the perpetuation of poor conditions and reinscribes inequality and prevents social mobility. I, in fact, adapted this quote from the work of Mario Romero, Mexican-American sociologist. And her work on critical race theory brings up the fact that when we only talk about labor, we're not only concealing privilege, it only frames or directs our research questions away from examining difference and inequality. And as a consequence, our policy recommendations, what are generated, when they focus on labor alone, maintain the status quo. So, in fact, these conversations that we have seen, that we have witnessed over the last few weeks, do not propose any kind of structural or core changes to the very essence of migrant labor. So to conclude, what can we do? What do we do next? I think that the COVID-19 response is providing all of us with a key opportunity for this sort of migrant labor reengineering intervention, if we want to call it. One in which we can create effective mechanisms for inclusion, for social and economic mobility. Here I'm going to draw from the work that Natalia Manulesco-Bogdan at MPI has provided in terms of we need to think about inclusion, social and economic mobility, not just isolation, especially when it comes to women, young children, and other marginalized newcomers. We also have to think beyond temporary measures or emergency measures in this case, and underscore the very need for accessible, safe, and dignified paths for mobility and employment. Labor dignifies people, provides them with dignity. So we need to think beyond this temporary or rushed measures. And just to conclude here, we have to demand clear and efficient paths for social mobility. Again, are not limited to labor conditions alone. And this includes paths to legalization or regularization. And I think, again, the work that migrants are carrying out, not from the ground in their communities, is very important. Again, we're very lucky to have Immokalee, the Immokalee Coalition, joining us today. Sex workers that are working across cities in Mexico to also provide for other migrant sex workers. And of course, the work that the groups and coalitions in Andalusia and Almeria in Spain are conducting to think beyond the emergency and to look long-term into political processes. I will stop right here. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm done, Andrew, whenever you want to take it from here.
Thanks, Gabriella. That was great. Thank you so much. And so we'll move straight on now to Letizia Palumbo, who's also from the Migration Policy Center. I don't know if she's changed her title too, but what I've got in front of me is When Migrants Become Essential to Feed Italy, Unmasking Structural Contradictions in Time of Pandemic. So I'm very happy to hand over now to Letizia.
So thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for participating in this interesting and, in my opinion, very important event today. So my presentation will focus on the impacts of the COVID-19 emergency on the agricultural sector in Italy, taking into account the working and living condition of agricultural workers and in particular migrant workers. What I would like to highlight in this presentation is that the current coronavirus crisis is actually highlighting, unveiling the structural limits and inequalities that characterize the agri-food system. In Italy, like in other European countries, core and labor-intensive sectors such as the agri-food production and distribution rely on the employment of foreign labor force, which is diversified by nationality, gender, and legal administrative status. Just to give you some quick information in terms of nationality, what we can see from this table is that the largest groups of agricultural workers in Italy are Romanians. And this is something that is specific through, for instance, in some area of Italy. I'm just thinking about the area of Ragusa in Sicily, which is an area that I know very well, where the presence of Romanian workers is really significant. And of course, we have to consider that when we look at this data, so when we consider official data concerning the agricultural worker, we have to know that this cannot offer an effective depiction of reality in this sector, because this sector is characterized by high rates of irregularity. And in addition to irregularity, the employment of migrant labor force in this sector is characterized by high flexibility, low wages, and poor and substandard working condition. In a recent study by the UI and Open Society European Policy Institute that I have co-authored with other researchers, what we have underlined in this study is that the demand for low-wage, exploitable, just-in-time migrant labor force is driven by the interplay of different factors, which include, first of all, value chain dynamics, and in particular, price-cost squeeze and the imbalance of power in long supply chains. But at the same time, this system takes advantages of the inadequacies of relevant European national policies of migration, asylum, and labor mobility. And of course, we have also considered the impacts of agricultural and rural policies at national and European level. So the current crisis is actually highlighting and shows us all these factors and dynamics. It shows us that our farming depends to a large extent on migrant labor. It shows us that exploitation is a structural component of this model of production, and that it shows us the structural inequality and contradiction that characterize these sectors. Indeed, as you know, since the outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis, a rise in demand for essential goods, especially food, has meant that agricultural workers, in particular migrant workers, has been sadly recognized as fundamental to feed countries such as Italy. In these scenarios, Italian farming associations have raised the alarm about wide-scale labor shortages, especially with respect to labor force from Eastern European countries as a consequence of border lockdowns. Indeed, according to official data, around 317,000 seasonal migrant workers will be missing this year, mainly from Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland. And more than 25% of the food produced on Italian land relies on the labor of these migrant workers. But it's also true that, and also as a consequence of the lack of an effective entry system for migrant workers capable of meeting the labor demand in sectors such as the agricultural sector, as a consequence also of this, the labor demand in this sector has been offset also by asylum seekers, refugees, and undocumented non-EU nationals. So where are they now? What we know is that many of these are stuck in informal encampments and in ghettos. So while crops road, ghettos are full of many people that live there and are stuck there. And this also because current emergency measures, by establishing high mobility restriction and control, have made it particularly difficult for many workers, in particular those working without a residence permit or a regular contract, to move and look for jobs opportunity. At the same time, and this is a sort of paradoxical effect of pandemic measures, these measures seem to have undermined illegal gangmaster systems such as caporalato. So that means that without the caporali, it's difficult for workers to move and to work, to go to work in the fields and to look for jobs opportunities. This because in some areas of Italy, especially in the south, caporalato is constitute de facto the main system of recruitment and transport of the agricultural labor force. At the same time, the degrading living condition of many migrant workers, especially in the South, raise even more concern at this time of health emergency, because especially in the South, as I said, many of these migrants live in isolated, crowded outbuildings in tent city or in slum, where it's possible to have many of the time without access to water or sanitation. So that means that in this context, the virus could have serious dramatic consequences. So in the light of this, what have been the institutional reactions and proposals? There have been many proposals for intervention. Here, I just want to focus on two of these. One has been then proposal suggested by national farmers organizations such as Coldiretti and the right-wing parties, and that has been that of implementing the voucher system in this sector in order to facilitate the recruitment of students, unemployed and national, and pensioners. This is for me quite problematic intervention and measure this, because the main idea seems to me that of Italian first, but without changing working conditions in these sectors, or even worse, the idea is that to introduce some instruments such as the voucher system, which concern occasional work relationship, and that can make the agricultural work more precarious and unprotected, including in terms of health protection. Another proposal has been that of the regularization of undocumented migrants. So it means to grant an amnesty to undocumented migrants. And this has been also supported by the Italian government. And in the last days, there has been a draft of the government decree on regularization, which in my opinion is quite inadequate, because first of all, it covers only agricultural workers in irregular condition. So it doesn't cover other categories of workers, such as, for instance, domestic workers, but there can be a long list of workers to be included. And it provides for temporary residence permits. So maximum 1 year. So that means, again, to create a situation of precariousness for these migrants. I would say that once again, the idea that I can say is that policy makers appear not to be focusing on workers, and not to be focusing on the protection of their fundamental rights, and not to be focusing on the need to ensuring them the real access to basic service and goods, and to really support their full social inclusion. So what I want to say to conclude is that although I think that regularization has many trade unions, organizations, the same workers are supporting and claiming it's necessary, and appears to be more necessary than ever in this period, but it should cover all workers in regular condition. And at the same time, I don't think that regularization is enough, and I don't think is the solution for fighting exploitation. So I do think that the current emergency is, as Gabriella was saying, an opportunity to address the structural contradiction and inequalities that characterize the agri-food system. And that means to really work, first of all, to change current national and also European migration policies in order to create safe and legal entry routes and channels, especially for migrant workers. Then looking at national legislation, that means also to address one of the main critical issue, which is the link between the residence permit and the labor contract, then it's necessary to bolster the wages and the rights of farm workers, as of course providing them with decent and real living conditions. And another important issue is to support alternative agri-food chains that can really ensure social inclusion and fair working conditions. I do think that national authorities with EU institutions should act now, and this intervention can no longer be postponed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Letizia. Before I hand over to Marley, can I just remind people of the system for questioning? If to ask a question, please use the chat function. You'll see a chat function in your menu bar. And if you can just put your question into there, it will come to us, and I can then put the questions to the panelists. And so now I'm really delighted to invite Marley Monacello from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers to present. So hand over to you, Marley.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our experiences and what has been happening here in Florida. So first, just to quickly review, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers is an internationally recognized human rights organization. We are an organization primarily of farm workers. We've been in operation for the past 30 years. The principal program of the CIW in normal times is the Fair Food Program, which is a partnership among major food buyers, including some of the largest in the world, like Walmart and McDonald's. And so partnership with them and major growers in the area, so multinational growers here in Florida that are responsible for millions of acres of harvested produce, and then farm workers themselves. And the point of the program is to ensure and protect the basic human rights of farm workers by harnessing the power of the market in order to ensure that business only really goes to growers that are protecting workers' rights and are adhering to the Fair Food Code of Conduct, which protects workers from everything from forced labor and sexual assault to dangerous working conditions and wage theft. I've had the privilege of working for the CIW for the past 8 years. I work on the Fair Food Program itself and have been assisting heavily in our operations, communications, and overall strategy in responding to the COVID-19 crisis for the past month. I also just want to give a little bit of a context of what the situation is with farm workers here in the US. It is in many ways similar to the conditions in Italy in particular and across Europe. But there, I think it's worth delving a little bit into the political context and legal context of farm workers overall prior to the pandemic. So, US farm workers are historically, even in the US, among the lowest paid and most vulnerable workforces. They are not protected by basic labor laws. Both farm workers and domestic workers are excluded from basic labor protections, including the right to organize. And historically, therefore, there have been many human rights abuses in the fields, and excuse me, and that's one of the reasons why the CIW came to exist in the first place, was in order to respond to those longstanding abuses. Immokalee, which is the town that we are based in here in Florida, is Florida's largest farm labor community. The state of Florida is one of the fruit baskets of the United States. In addition to states like California or Texas, Florida produces a huge portion of the domestically produced hand-picked produce. Florida alone produces 1.1 billion tomatoes each season. And in particular, during the season, so between about October and May, South Florida feeds over 150 million consumers in the US in the eastern half. So I just want to situate where we are as a really critical region when it comes to the agricultural economy. And so anything that happens here will also obviously have a major impact up the supply chain as well. And similar to what Letizia was describing, farm workers in the US also have many underlying conditions that make them especially vulnerable to a major outbreak of COVID-19. And so farm workers live in severely crowded housing situations. They are transported every day in cramped vans and buses with dozens of coworkers at a time. They often lack things like clean bathrooms and hand washing facilities and drinking water in the fields. Again, we've seen a real split in what workers are facing in our area because the Fair Food Program has been able to improve so many of those conditions. So workers going to Fair Food Program farms are distributed a lot more on buses. They are provided with personal protective gear, and they have much better conditions at work. But unfortunately, there are many other industries that remain outside of the Fair Food Program and workers that are still facing conditions that they might have seen 50 years ago. And these conditions, of course, are the result of generations of poverty. And unfortunately, that combination will act as a superconductor for transmission of the virus when and if it is in Immokalee. In spite of that, there have been fewer than 100 tests done for the Immokalee community, which is over 25,000 people. As I'm sure you've seen in the news, the US has failed miserably at instituting a broader testing strategy across the country, and that is felt nowhere more acutely than here in Immokalee. And moreover, the local and state authorities have taken very few steps to ensure the safety of the state's farm worker community, in spite of the fact that farm workers have been deemed, of course, essential workers. And on top of that is kind of the final major challenge for our areas, because it is a densely populated but rural area. There is no hospital in Immokalee. There are no ICUs, there are no ventilators, there are no trained hospital staff. The closest hospital is about an hour away. And of course, many workers don't have access to private transportation, and public transportation is also extremely limited, and more so during the crisis. And one more note on the broader political response for the US. I think the US has been unique in that it has really dealt at the federal level, at the national level, the government has failed to take a coordinated response. And so instead, there is a huge range of responses that governors have taken across the US. And so there is, for example, California, which is another large agricultural state, put a shelter-in-place order already on March 20th, versus Florida, which is a much more conservative state and much more resistant to putting in important measures in order to protect the population from COVID-19. And so our shelter-in-place order has only been in place since April 3rd. And there are still 8 states across the US that have not instituted any shelter-in-place whatsoever. And so there is a huge range of responses, which means, of course, given the nature of a pandemic, that we are, very concerned about the potential of spread. Even with the limited testing that has happened in Immokalee, there are 28 documented cases. They are non-cluster cases, and so we are unfortunately looking at a situation in which it is almost certain that the coronavirus is already spreading around Immokalee, and that we will be looking at a major crisis for our health system in a matter of weeks. So in the absence of any meaningful response from the local and state government, our organization at the CIW has really shifted all of our operations to focus on responding. We have really tried to fill that vacuum. I do want to share just a couple of visuals to help illustrate some of the strategies that we have taken. I'm just going to put those up very quickly. Yes, great. And so one of the main tools of the CIW is our community radio station. So this station is both streaming online and, of course, is available in Immokalee. It's been an essential tool in getting good information out to workers, because in addition to the state level not providing that information, we have also, it has not been provided in the appropriate languages, and a lot of people are getting false information and misinformation from places like Facebook. And so the CIW has done a ton of programming in multiple languages on our radio station. We've been hosting live interviews with doctors and public health experts in Spanish in order to be able to respond to workers' questions. We've also been using popular education. So this is a longstanding tradition of the CIW. In order to really reach the worker community, we've been creating original artwork and drawings and posters to plaster around town and to share on social media as well. So this, for example, was from really early on when there was still a lot of denial in the community about the gravity of the situation. And so you have the figure of death, kind of whispering to this worker that this is only an issue that affects older workers, and he's really strong, and kind of channeling a lot of the information we were hearing in the community itself and trying to push back against that. And of course, encouraging people to listen to the radio in order to get good information. Also doing other types of, again, multilingual posters in order to promote the use of masks, which again has been really important, and something that we've not only tried to focus on outreach and education, but also on actually marshaling healthcare resources for the area. So for example, again, given that there has been no effort on the part of the government or in many non-fair food program employers to provide health and safety materials, farm worker women in Immokalee actually worked with us to fundraise for materials and have themselves sewn and produced hundreds of reusable masks. And then we have been doing distribution in the community in order and educating workers about the use of masks and how to care for them. So it's really taken a community response in order to have any level of protection for the farm worker community and a high level of organizing. We also were able to rely on our, sorry, I think that's my 10-minute mark, but if I could have just another minute or so, if that's all right, Andrew. Great. So we relied on our partnerships with growers in order to get things like hand washing stations also put around town that were not being utilized on the farm. And so, what we've really tried to do is leverage all of our strengths in order to respond to this crisis. And the last thing I'll say is, on that note, and kind of going back to Gabriella's final, initial framing of this conversation, I think that this, of course, all around the world, this crisis has revealed the inequality and the poverty and just generally speaking, the vulnerability of many communities. And so one of the lessons that we've taken from this is that it is all the more important to build resilience for the long run. And that is what the Fair Food Program is able to do. We have seen that this incredibly powerful market-based program in normal times is able to protect workers' basic human rights, and then in times of crisis, to protect their very lives. So to be able to marshal organized resources for workers who already have a voice and have a presence in the community to be able to work together in order to respond to these crises, even when there is a lack of a formal government response, has been incredibly important. And so, we are as dedicated as ever to expanding the Fair Food Program and the overall worker-driven social responsibility model in order to ensure that workers for the next crisis are less vulnerable than they are today. So thank you all very much.
Great, thank you, Marley. So what we do now is we move to questions. Some people have already sent questions in on using the chat function. Other people are welcome to do so. I'm going to do my best to put the questions to our panelists. So we'll have a first round now. So some of the questions are coming through. First of all, we've got a question for Marley, which is from Lila, who is asking about the financial capacities of landowners and farmers. She assumes they have the financial means to pay their workers better. She's
Sure.
in the extent to which large landowners have more resources, smaller ones maybe not so many resources. So they're necessary to wage what the implications are for wages. And also she asked what effect it would have on the employment of natives. Would it significantly raise their employment and willingness to work in the field? So looking at that, we'll ask a few questions, then we'll come back to you. Letizia, some people are sending us requests for sharing of slides, sharing of resources, which we're happy to do. We can get back to you about that. Quite a few people are interested in this for Letizia to speak a little bit more about the proposals for regularization. So Liliana is asking about, whether this is likely to be signed into law anytime soon, and Ruth Ferrero is asking about whether perhaps this could have got as a question that's for Gabriella, but opening a wider debate in Europe about how much attention should be paid to essential services such as agriculture and relocation of industries. And Ruth is asking about the extent to which you think it should be possible to introduce the migration issue into the political discourse without increasing support for the extreme right, anti-immigration political forces. That's a question from Ruth or Gabriella. From Luca, a couple of questions to Letizia. He talks about a recent radio interview that Minister Bellanova and Col Diretti and the Confederazione Agricoltori, where they're all agreeing that agricultural chains are based on the vast majority of legal work and small numbers of irregulars. And you seem to be saying that the number is much larger than this kind of idea that there's a small number. Are there any estimates available? And I think I'll leave it for there as a first round. So perhaps start with you, Marley, and then we'll go to Letizia and Gabriella. Is that okay?
Sure.
Thank you. So over to you, Marley.
Sure. So yeah, I think that's a really important question, is the role of industry in responding to not only this crisis, but also the overall condition. And so here in the US, the analysis that the CIW came to very early on in the early 2000s was that, in fact, the profit margin for within the supply chain was actually much more concentrated at the buyer level than at the grower level. And so as a part of the Fair Food Program, one of the things that farm workers were fighting for was a fair food premium. And so all of the major buyers, there's 14 now, who joined the Fair Food Program, pay an extra penny per pound of tomatoes that they buy. And that penny travels through the supply chain to appear in workers' checks in the form of a bonus. And so that, and it sounds like a pretty small amount, but when we're talking about billions of tons of tomatoes, over the course of the program's life, we've actually seen over $32 million be redistributed from that level at the buyers to workers in their paychecks. And so what does that mean for workers on a regular basis? In US dollars, that can be anywhere from 50 to 80, even 100 extra dollars a week, which for farm worker wages is really quite significant. Again, I think that was the CIW's creative solution to two challenges with trying to overall improve wages. One, that farm workers don't have a federally recognized option to organize, and also because that really, when it came down to it, that the growers and farmers in the US are I mean, it depends on the industry, but that's really not where the large profit margin is. And so now, of course, as we partner with growers who, again, are in the program in large part because their buyers are calling for that, I think that that reality has only been further supported by what we've seen, which is basically that the people with the capacity to ensure that wages are more sustainable down the supply chain are in fact the major buyers, because that's really where the huge leap in profit margin is.
Great, thank you, Marley. So Letizia.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you for the question, which are really important. So in relation to regularization, according to what the Minister Bellanova said in the last speech of 2 days ago, so the regularization will be, the final decree for regularization will be ready by the end of the month. And again, I think that the current draft of the decree should be revised, as I said, covering all the irregular migrants and not only the agricultural workers. Connected to the second question, which is, if I understood correctly, is connected to the administrative status of many of these migrant workers. What is interesting here is that, and this is connected to the fact that, according to me, regularization is necessary, but is not the solution for exploitation, is the fact that in the last years, what we have seen is that there's been an increase of Eastern European migrant workers, but also asylum seekers and refugees, which has been exploited in that means that exploitation, that first of all, citizenship is not guarantee any kind of protection in terms of severe forms of exploitation. And second one means that even in a situation of having a legal residence permit, that means that person can be involved in situation of severe and serious exploitation. So that's the reason why I do think that regularization need to be accompanied by other important intervention aimed at addressing the structural factor that create and this system which really builds on the exploitation of migrant workers.
Thanks, Letizia. And Gabriella?
Here we go. Okay, thank you for the question. And I'm glad that the notion of far right and nationalism was brought up. In fact, when I started to look at some of the coverage concerning this notion of this great agricultural armies that were going out to the fields to support the nation, to bring it forward here in Europe, that made me think about that precisely. How that was going to clash with, and again, I'm going to bring back the issue of race and gender. We are talking about forms of labor that are highly racialized and gendered. We are not, and this has been the historical trajectory of agriculture. This is depending on relying on the work of newcomers, of outsiders, of people who are not supposed to receive any kind of protection. And here, I think that as part of this political process, I think this is where, again, the coalition set an example, a coalition of Immokalee workers, in terms of deciding this market-based program. Because I believe that one of the challenges that a lot of organizing had was precisely this focus on what can we do right now, how can we maintain some level of stability, but not many times looking at structures, and what would be a structural change at the root. So, and I think this was also very, working directly with the growers, in trying to address, again, looking beyond some of the piecemeal decisions or mechanisms that were or have been traditionally offered in terms of the industry was key. I also very much agree with Letizia in terms that regularization is not the solution to exploitation at all. And I think this is, it is going to be the very presence of Eastern European migrants in this context is very relevant, because I'm sure that, those of you who work in agriculture have seen that the racism and discrimination also is very much connected to the kinds of treatment to the specific groups of migrants are receiving. So it is true that regularization is not the only solution. And this is why precisely, again, this more innovative processes that try to look more at the issues that are connected with the market have been effective at generating more specific kinds of change.
Thank you, Gabriella. So there's some more questions. I'll do my best to get them to the speakers. We have a question from Pavel, who asks, which is a question for Letizia, and it's about whether there are any serious alternatives to immigrant labour in Italian agriculture, automation or capital intensive investments. And I suppose what Pavel's getting at are the underlying conditions for this dependence on foreign labour in Italian agriculture. And also Silvio Greco also asked a question which could go to Letizia, which is really whether regularization is better than nothing, better than doing nothing. It's pragmatic. It may be, so Silvio wanted to ask you about that. We have a question from Abba, who refers to the situation in Nepal, but I think this is a general issue that perhaps we could put to Marley, which is about safety at work, where Abba talks about the situation in Kathmandu, where the Department of Roads is using migrant labour to repair and maintain roads, but puts workers under stress. And I think there's a general issue there about additional stress and the kind of issues around safety in these times, which perhaps Marley could address. That was a question from Abba. Sorry, if you just excuse me while I just scroll down. Anna Triandafilidou, one of our friends from EUI. Hello, Anna, in Canada now. She's got a question for Letizia. She asked, does she think that the current situation would benefit from EU-level regulation, or are local national responses more appropriate? So that's a question from Anna for Letizia. A question from Emanuela, who is in Sydney, and she asks a question which I put to Gabriella, which is about health cover and the healthcare protection for migrant workers during the crisis. Some of the issues that might be raised there. It's a very big and important question for Emanuela. So I'll leave it there for now. I think that's some questions to be getting on with. So thank you very much for those. Maybe if we start with, is it okay to start with you this time, Gabriella? Can we start with you? You need to unmute yourself.
If I understood correctly, it was about health coverage?
Yeah, the extent to which migrants are covered by, have health cover during this COVID. So maybe you might know some very specific instances. Obviously, it's a big global concern, but maybe some of that perhaps you know some specific evidence around health cover inadequacies or issues in healthcare and health and protection.
What I do know from my own field of experience is precisely the lack of clear paths to medical care. So we're talking about, specifically when we talk about migrants who work the fields, this involves many times being in locations very far away from any kind of medical care or access to support. In the sense, and this is also going to depend on what context or what country we're in. The kinds of coverage that you can receive in Europe is completely different to the kind that you would be able to receive in the United States. So also, I'm sure that Marley can talk a lot more about that in case of, but in general, the cost that involves accessing health services in the United States is prohibitive for most of the people who work the fields. So even, and especially at this time, many people they simply don't have many times the logistical ability to get to these locations where they would be able to receive care, in addition to the fact that they are not present within their own communities. So this was also one of the points that was raised by the communities in Almeria, in Andalusia and southern Spain, the fact that they are many times in so-called irregular settlements that are very much away from the city, and lacking public transportation or just the basic means to get to a location. The fact that they are not recognized settlements prevents the people many times from just accessing emergency services.
Thank you, Gabriella. Letizia?
Yeah. Thank you again for the question. So first of all, that connect to what can be the alternatives, and in specific about the use of technologies. Okay, first I got with the first is connected to the use of technology. I not really sure about that. There are many studies, in particular connected to Northern Europe, but also to the South of Europe, that show that the impact of technology is quite ambiguous with respect to the protection of labor rights. So I do think that the use of technology, before using technology, it needs to be addressed the system in which workers are forced to work and the condition under which they are forced to work. Otherwise, we are not really changing and undermining this kind of model of production. The other thing connected to regularization, I know that it's better than nothing, and that's just to be clear. I think that it's necessary today to do in Italy a regularization. Just say that first of all needs to cover all the irregular migrant workers, and second one, I was saying that is not. It should be accompanied by a review and a change of national policies on migration and asylum, and at the same time cannot be considered as a solution for situation of exploitation and abusive form of employment. And this is connected to the idea of serious alternative. I do think that the main issues that need to be addressed today, considering the situation of exploitation in the agricultural sector, needs to be, first of all, consider the system of recruitment of these workers, which is not something that needs to be addressed. And the existence of the caporalato is a proof that the state is not doing enough, not to say it's not doing nothing in regard to this. Second one, of course, it needs to be, it is connected to the issue of caporalato. It needs to be, the other issue that needs to be addressed is the problem of transportation for these workers. Otherwise, they will be still dependent on abusive employers and caporale, and the list can be so on. But another important issue is to address the poor wages, because the level of wages, and also if we consider that today we are saying in the news that these workers are fundamental to feed our countries, and if we look at the level of their wages, they are totally poor and under the all level considered by national regulation. If you, Andrew, can tell me the question by Anna, because I couldn't hear you.
Sorry, excuse me, I will go back to it.
Because I couldn't hear you.
Well, maybe we'll come back to that. I will find it. We will come back to that question. I'll put some more questions. There are so many that I'm scrolling down, so I don't want to waste everybody's time while I scroll up and down the chat box to try and find the question. So now I've got some more questions which people have very kindly sent in. So if we begin, well, Miriam Boudra puts a general question, which I think we'll put to Gabriella. And Miriam asks whether regularization of migrants is a sustainable, or I think you suggest it's not a sustainable solution. And Miriam asks if that point can be developed further. I think it was a point also made by Letizia as well. We'll put that to Gabriella. And maybe also to Gabriella, what about migrant domestic workers and the challenges they may be facing? We've not talked about that so much today, but I think that could be a seminar in itself easily. It's a hugely important topic. So maybe if Gabriella could reflect on that point. We have a question which I put to Marley, and it's a question from Jotsna. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing people's names wrongly, but and asked about that the pandemic has given images of poverty, alienation, and inequalities, and what was more visible were male migrants in media coverage. And Jotsna is asking, where are women migrants, and what could be the possible repercussions for women migrants when lockdown is phased out in terms of wages and employment? Maybe if Marley could address that issue, thank you. And also for Marley, from Caterina, who asks about the experience of Radio Coscienza, and she's concerned about the absence of irregular farm workers' voice during the crisis. And she's referring particularly to the Italian context. And what Caterina would like to ask is how to detect people's voices, and perhaps learning from your experiences to give a voice to people who maybe aren't or who are not heard or visible in these debates. Perhaps your experiences on the effectiveness of your campaigning. And a question for Letizia. You mentioned your presentation, this is from Amy Weatherburn. You mentioned your presentation disparity between national and European responses to migration, asylum and labour mobility. And it's asked, how do you see the situation post-COVID? I think we're all hoping for a situation post-COVID, to be honest. Do we need to focus on harmonising national and European responses, or focusing on improving national responses? What's the role of the EU? And also going back to that point from Patricia, the Royal Institute Elcano in Madrid, in a way, is this the last chance for the EU? For the EU to kind of maybe deal with this issue, to maybe running out of opportunities to actually deal effectively with these kind of issues. So maybe start again with Gabriella.
Thank you so much for the very first question, because this notion again of regularization, in fact, this is a conversation that Andrea and I were having for a different paper, different issue. I think that so far regularization campaigns have been seen as the solution, but they are, if we look at them long term, if we start looking at them historically, we see that they are again kind of this patchy solutions, because they may work at some point, but then they create these gaps of time over which people are not, that do not fall, or they are not, this American word of being grandfathered on their specific protections, fall through the cracks. So we many times these regularization campaigns further inequality, because they continue perpetuating some of the, again, as Letizia was saying, the structure, the essential structure of exploitation is not disturbed. So there, we have many times in the agricultural setting people who have worked their entire lives there. And this is despite the fact that they have documents, that they are many times citizens of the countries where they work. But the mechanisms that restrict them, and this is what I was talking about in the presentation, the social construction of agricultural labor prevents them from moving into other circles. So when we only talk about labor, when we only think about what is the corresponding form of labor that a migrant can have access to, we have to think long term. What are going to be other solutions? What are going to be options for people who want to look for other options outside of agriculture, outside of for the provision of intimate care or of domestic work? Because this is again the way we have, or the way the states have provided or have engaged in regularization campaigns, just foster in many ways inequality and insecurity, and therefore precarity. When we talk about migrant domestic workers, I would love to have one just on women, or not only on women, but on the gender and gender dimensions of migrant domestic work. I think in the case of women, what we have seen, and this is also from, just this very anecdotal series of observations here in Florence. Right after the COVID emergency was declared, the only women that you would see the only people that you would see riding public transportation were women, primarily South American women who were riding to work. And you could hear them talking, on the buses saying, like, I have to go to work. I'm expected to be at work. So that's, again, this expectation, not only the cultural expectation that women have to continue providing care, but also the demands on the part of the employers that, well, you want to continue supporting your family back home. So I am a great employer, just come and keep working, without providing any kind of protection, going back to the essence of exploitation that Letizia kept mentioning. So in the case, again, of if you walk through many of the cities, again in Italy and in Spain, where the language is an advantage in a sense for Latin American migrant female workers, you would still see them. And women still have to go to work. They are still expected to provide care, not only for the people that they work for, but also for their families and for themselves. So this is another important point to bring up in the conversation. You know, what are, again, the gender and ethnicity or identity-based dimensions that are being played as part of the crisis. And I think those were the two of the main points, if I am not wrong with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriella. Letizia, because we have, if people could be, if the responses could be quite brief, we're getting quite a lot of questions coming in, and we're in the final few minutes.
Okay.
The big questions, but
I respond also to the question of Hannah, which is related to the EU policies and what role can have EU institution in this. I do think that now the EU can play a relevant role in really addressing this contradiction and inequalities that we were mentioned related to the agri-food system. In our study with Open Society Foundation, what we have highlighted is that one of the main issues, for instance, can be that to consider inside the common agricultural policies, the European common agricultural policies, pay specific attention to the social dimension, which has been so far something that the CAP has not considered. So one of our proposals has been that, for instance, to make CAP payments conditional on the respect for labor, health, and safety, as well as environmental standards. In terms of migration policies, I would say that there will be many points to be addressed at EU level, and one of these has to be that really develop and strengthen legal and safe channels for low and medium skilled migrant workers, because the attention so far has been in particular to high skilled workers. And so what we really need now is to focus on low and medium skilled workers, providing them the possibility to a long-term inclusion in our labor market and protected in terms protection in terms of rights. The last, well, I could say other important instrument that we have at EU level. I want just to mention that another institute that I think can play an important role is a new recent institution, which is the European Labour Authority, which can play an important role in terms of contributing to protect and support initiatives aimed at the safeguard and the protection of the rights of workers, and also in terms of monitoring issues. To conclude, I do think it is just to connect to what Gabriella was saying, that the gender dimension is something that is very important also with regard to the agricultural sector. And it is, again, it's something that is very important also with regard to the care work that many migrant agricultural work, of course, have to combine with their work. So when we consider, when we think about agricultural work, we just think that is mainly male, that is mainly carried out by men, but there are many women that are doing this work.
Thank you, Letizia. Marley?
Great. So I'll just, since we're on that question, we'll just quickly on the gender dynamic. I think that you know, within the US context, the vast majority of the workforce is male. I think it's around, maybe 15 to 20% women, but nevertheless, women have taken a huge role in the response effort and have really stepped up to be a part of that. So I just want to mention that in particular here. And similarly, women are far more responsible for family during this time. So going back to an earlier question about stress and the healthcare system as well, one of the things we've been hearing from a lot of women in the community in particular is their high level of concern for their family and this feeling of being kind of between a rock and a hard place because they are so economically insecure, they cannot afford to stay home. And as Gabriella was saying, you know, when it comes down to it, there's the expectation, especially that essential workers go to work, even if they aren't being protected, even if they aren't being paid sufficiently. And so a lot of mothers in particular have expressed this concern of either I go to work and risk getting sick and then risk giving it to my children or to the other people and other families who live in this trailer that I share with 12 other people, or I risk my livelihood and I potentially lose the ability to have shelter in the first place. And so that, of course, that is also shared with men who have families and who live in similar living conditions. I think that is something that is shared, but certainly in our community, women are more responsible for family typically. And so women in the workforce have expressed that. On the question of the radio and making sure to ensure that immigrant worker voices and farm worker voices are at the forefront, I think that we have to frame that as a practical question, because it is of course preferable and humane, and I think important to recognize the humanity in the voices of people who are doing this work. But going back to the original question about how farm workers are framed as, as poor and as victims, we really need to see them also as the source of the solution. And that has always been the underpinning of the CIW's work, is that farm workers alone are the most qualified experts to be able to talk about what the actual issues are and therefore what the solution should be. And so the question of farm workers being, their voices being lifted up and their experiences being looked at is really a question that is necessary if we are going to be able to respond adequately to any problem, whether it's longstanding abuses or how to respond to the COVID-19 crisis in this context. You have to hear from the experts who are experiencing the problem in order to craft a viable solution. And so I think that's one piece of it on the public level. And then within the community, again, as you saw from my presentation, this has really been a community protecting itself in the absence of the government stepping in. And so I think there's also been a huge importance to having credibility. So farm workers hearing from other farm workers who are sharing credible information has been important, given the misinformation being spread by the government itself, as well as online. Having credible sources of info from within the community and having farm worker leadership in that sense of taking the lead on education and outreach has been critically important. And then the final thing, again, just going back to the question to some of the questions that came up earlier around healthcare and access to healthcare. So just quickly, within the US, of course, it is a private healthcare system. And so just to give you a sense, even with insurance, if a woman goes to give birth in a hospital with good insurance, she still owes upwards of $4,000 US to the healthcare system. So it is exorbitantly expensive. And certainly one of the biggest concerns we've had is that many farm workers don't have access to insurance or any kind. There is no public option. There is no state-run insurance system or healthcare system. And as a result, even in thinking about the hospital that's an hour away from Immokalee, that hospital is shared with an incredibly wealthy white community in Naples, Florida. And so when it comes down to a major outbreak of COVID-19, and a hospital is choosing who to give ventilators to and who to give ICU beds to, if there is a major strain on the system, they're obviously going to find every way possible, as they always have, to exclude uninsured immigrant workers in favor of making sure that those resources are going to their very wealthy citizens. And so I think that's important to mention. And finally, in terms of stress and insecurity, we have already talked a bit about the economic insecurity that makes it impossible for workers to protect themselves. And I think that has been a huge source of stress for workers, is having to face incredible health and safety risks at work, but living paycheck to paycheck. So it's not a choice to stay home. And then of course, we do have a guest worker system here in the US. And so even though pay is a bit more for guest workers, they're tied to a particular employer in such a way that they literally have no choice about where they are, where they go. They rely on their employer for housing, for transportation, and obviously for employment. And so those workers similarly are here on a contract. And so regardless of whether or not you are an undocumented farm worker here in the US, or you're here on a guest worker visa, or you're a US citizen, a lot of people are facing, because of that, because of the economic insecurity, really don't have a choice to protect themselves or to make the choice to stay home.
Thank you, Marley. We're running very short of time, and we've got, and I really apologise if I don't get to all of the questions. I'm trying to pick through. We're very grateful that you've sent them in, and I'll try and pick out some more, which I think issues we've not been, we maybe haven't been directly addressed. We have a question from Chiara Manzoni, which maybe Gabriella could address. What Chiara is interested in is the extent to which it's dangerous to debate about who should be regularised and who not, the risk of the good and the bad migrant. And she refers to the case of the UK and the debate about the NHS visa extension for nurses, doctors and paramedics. But what about all the other key workers? Then we have a question from Stefano Deli Uberti. Maybe this question could go to Letizia. And what Stefano is asked about is solidarity between local communities and migrant workers. And he's interested in the extent to which there is evidence of the development of kind of solidarity initiatives of social and health support between local communities and migrants. So, I mean, they're all part of the same community, but sort of different groups within communities. Perhaps Marley could also address that from a US perspective as well. And maybe as a question we have from Julie Kurtz, which I think maybe also to Marley, and it's perhaps to reflect on the Immokalee experience. And are there countries, and what Julie asks is, are there countries that operate a robust agri-food system without depending on migrant or exploitative labour, and with effective state regulation, for instance, to keep the private sector in check? Or is it necessary, or basically you're always going to, it's necessary to have this CIW model of accountability and voice from the bottom up? And going back to the question of Anna Triandafiliou, which I think Letizia addressed, which was really about the relevance of national and European frameworks in this context. That was a question from Anna, which we didn't get round to last time. And a question from Irini Avaliatou, who asked about trade unions and their position. Irini talks about the Veneto region in Italy and the role of trade unions, but I have said maybe for some, perhaps Gabriella could talk about whether there's any evidence of kind of role of trade unions. Other speakers may have experience of this as well. And then a very final question, which is from Sebastian, which is for Letizia. And he asked about the extent to which you think the securitization of migration has impacted on the response to COVID-19, in particular the security decree introduced when by the previous Interior Minister Salvini, in the way in which that has reduced the response capacity of the state against the virus. That's a question from Sebastian. So, as I said, I apologise if I didn't get to everybody's question. I've tried to address the areas that have been raised in the questions, but apologies if I didn't get to your question. But hopefully you've got some value from the responses of our panelists. If I perhaps start with Gabriella this time, if that's okay.
Well, first of all, let me say that I have no awareness or no knowledge of trade unions, so I wouldn't be able to answer that question. But going back to the one that was concerning this notion of the good and the bad migrant, I think that diverts, and distracts us very much from the actual issues. It has become so, they become this hyper politicized processes, and they lead us to focus on these debates that really don't have any impact on the actual lives of migrants. And the ones that continue to work the fields, that continue to go to our homes, taking care of children, or working at hospitals for that matter. So the very images that we have seen continuously, on media. Here, I think I would turn therefore to what points that what Marley and Letizia have already made in terms of how the communities themselves are teaching us. The communities themselves are mobilizing and have being able to craft through networks of solidarity, of self-support, these mechanisms of protection. Now, that doesn't mean that that's all we have to rely on, or that they have to rely on, because that is not at the same time their obligation. This is something that emerges precisely from the lack of structures, from the very chains of exploitation that support the markets that we rely on. So in that sense, I go back to the work that the coalition has done, how this direct work, with the growers has been so effective. And something that I really want to once again emphasize, that Marley has already mentioned, recognize the very work that migrants are doing. They are the experts. And I think that, again, as policymakers, as academics, we tend to always come up with solutions for them. The very fact that here we are, oh, what's the debate? Or how can we contribute to the debate? But again, we're not contributing to changing the structures that are impacting directly people. But at the same time, we're not creating spaces for them to join the conversation. And not only, and of course, there's the local participation, but there's also the political participation and the visibility. And that is something that all of us are responsible for targeting.
Thank you, Gabriella. Letizia?
Thank you, and thank you again for the question. I will start with the impact of the Decreti Salvini decree, which for me has been a very dangerous impact. First of all, it has increased the position of vulnerability of many migrant workers and asylum seekers. And as an effect of this, which is connected also to the COVID-19 crisis, we have been an increase in undocumented migrants as an effect of this decree. So that means that we have an increase of people that are invisible and that cannot access to basic service such as health service, etc., etc. So related to this, regularization is very important. The second point connected to the impact of the Salvini decree is the fact that, as you probably know, one of the main provisions has been the exclusion of asylum seekers from state reception system, the SPRAR, which were in a way, in terms of condition, better than other reception centers. That means that many migrants now are hosted in a reception center where their living conditions are bad. In that situation, social distancing measures are quite impossible to apply. So that again is a connection to the impact and the effect of the Salvini decree. Related to trade unions intervention, I'm very familiar with what the trade union, in particular CGIL, is doing in the area of Ragusa. I'm working with them and supporting their work, and what they are doing, it's really trying to, of course, they are supporting the idea of regularization, but also to really focus on the issue of wages and labor condition, which has to be the main issue to be addressed today when we think about that sector. Related to this is the issue of solidarity and local communities. Again, I can tell you about what I see in the area of Ragusa and Sicily, and there the support of community is very important and significant. It is always like this, and in particular in this moment of emergency. But again, as Gabriella was saying, the role of community is fundamental and important, but cannot substitute the role of the state, which has to be fundamental in this case. Yeah, with regard to the question of Anna, so the current situation with agricultural seasonal work and if they would benefit from EU regulation or national regulation, I do think with respect to EU legal instrument that the Seasonal Workers Directive is an important instrument, but I think that is really built on an employer-driven system and provide member states with wide discretionary power in the implementation of important provisions concerning particularly the rights and the protection of seasonal workers. So these are the limits of this instrument. And in any case, I do think that it's necessary at EU level, as I say again, to really think to some form of channel and way for migrant workers, including seasonal migrant workers, to be included in a very long-term way in the labor market in Europe. Just the last thing, if I can, is in connection to the seasonal workers and national regulation. We know that one of the main systems in Italy is the so-called Decreto Flussi, which actually is very has a lot of limits, and one of these has been, for instance, the fact that it is not really helpful to respond to the real demand for labor force in the agricultural sector. And at the same time, in the last years, especially since 2012, the quota for seasonal workers has been drastically and significantly reduced. So actually, if some seasonal workers want to come here to Italy and work in the agricultural sector, the possibilities are very limited.
Marley?
Yep. So quickly, I think and I think that the question of kind of solidarity efforts and then the broader question about the role of regulation and the possibility of regulation to improve conditions as opposed to the CIW's model of leveraging the market are very much interrelated. You know, so one is about the big picture of looking at migrant rights and farm worker rights, and one is about the specific situation. I think that it is, you know, I am not an expert on the European context, and but I can tell you that from in the US, even in places where there in states, for example, that have a much more progressive and responsive government, the role of the power that corporations have and that large-scale companies have in terms of determining conditions in the supply chain is still enormous. So for within our context, and at least in the immediate future, as far as I can see, especially in places that have less of a culture of regulation and less effective enforcement strategies, it is critically important for communities and consumers who have a huge amount of power to hold those companies accountable. Because what the CIW's model is taking the expertise and leadership of workers who know the contours of the problem and therefore can craft a viable, sustainable, and effective solution, and pairing that with the power of consumers. Because, you know, the market, whether or not we like it, especially given how globalized it has become, is an incredibly powerful force today, and one that is frankly overcoming the power of government in many contexts, most certainly in the United States. And so that is nowhere more clear and visible than in states like Florida, because again, there is, you know, as many countries, it's a very diverse country politically, and in particular in states like Florida, where there is no Department of Labor for the state of Florida. There really is no regulation whatsoever. And so that is why this model grew up in this particular place. You know, it emerged from that context and really illustrated the two farm workers that basically no one was coming to support them, no one was coming to protect them, and in spite of the essential work that they were performing, and in spite of the egregious abuses that they were facing while they were doing that labor. And so for us, I think harnessing the power of the market and recognizing how important that is, whether that harnessing is done at a government level with truly effective enforcement, so not just legislation, but real teeth and enforcement power, that role is, that kind of accountability absolutely does have to come from from consumers, but again, the expertise in actually crafting the solution has to come from workers. So that is the premise of the model that the CIW has helped to create of worker-driven social responsibility. And that's exactly what that concept is worker leadership, harnessing the power of the market to really enforce human rights. And again, we've seen that same dynamic play out in this context, because I think a lot of what the CIW has been doing could be put in the framework of mutual aid and solidarity work and a community kind of coming together to protect itself in the absence of real action on the part of the state. You know, I will say that there is still a range of kind of a culture around that. I think we've been in communication, for example, with healthcare workers who want to support farm worker efforts, but who are based in California, and there's a much more robust culture and infrastructure, you know, in the academic world and just broadly speaking, in that space for those kinds of community-based efforts in terms of actual infrastructure. And that is also something lacking on a broader community scale in places like Florida, which all the more underscores the importance of farm workers really taking on that leadership, because when it comes down to it, in any circumstance, the rights holders, the people, you know, when we're talking about human rights or talking about the right to work safely, the rights holders are the people who are have the greatest vested interest in seeing a solution that is truly effective. And so they really have to be the leading voice on that, whether that's holding the government accountable or holding, you know, leaders in the market accountable. So I hope that kind of can encapsulate both of those questions. But I think, unfortunately, I wish I could say that there was a light at the end of the tunnel in looking for some greater responsibility and action on the part of government here in the U.S. But I think that you know, there isn't really a prospect of that, certainly not where we are. And so I think that we have to learn how to take responsibility as consumers and as citizens, and fundamentally recognize that the market does have a lot of power in determining the conditions that workers are laboring under, and devise systems to hold them accountable.
Great, thank you, Marley. So I think we'll have to bring the webinar, sorry, to a conclusion. But I think there's a really important point about responsibility that Marley made. I think those are things we can all reflect on as lessons from the seminar. It's been really informative and critical and engaging. So I hope that those of you who've been with us have found it a useful experience, and we're very grateful for all the questions that have been sent in. I apologise for not being able to deal with all the questions, but hopefully the discussion has been useful for you. We've covered a lot of themes. So just three final things, well, a couple of final things. A video of this webinar will be made available, and all our webinars, videos will be made available on our YouTube channel. And also to publicise our next webinar, which is in 2 weeks' time, which will be on travel restrictions, looking in particular at Europe and African experiences. So same time, 3 o'clock Central European time in 2 weeks' time. And so finally, I'd just like to thank Marley. It's been great for us at the MPC to connect with the CIW, and hopefully will be other connections in the future. And obviously to thank Sarah and Gabriella for the great work they've been doing as part of the MPC. So yeah, thank you, and thank you to everybody for joining us. We're in our living rooms and kitchens, wherever you are, and I hope you stay well, stay safe, and you're able to connect with the MPC for our future activities. So thanks very much for your time.
Thank you all so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thanks, Akira, for all the coordination, and Giovanni as well for the technical support.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.